again, and welcome to our 4th episode in Season 2 of the History She Wrote book club. This time we're tackling the Szapierski book, The Beautiful Mrs. Seidenman, about a group of Poles living under Nazi occupation in 1943 Warsaw. And today we'll be reading up to page 178. When last we discussed our intrepid Polish heroine, we left Mrs. Seidenman living under the name Maria Gostomska in the belly of the beast at Gestapo headquarters at Schucha Street. Incidentally, those former headquarters are now a museum and can be visited in Warsaw. I highly recommend such a visit because it will make entirely clear the horrors that people taken there were exposed to. Needless to say, Mrs. Seidenman was not having a good time of it, and she was not aware that outside the house of the Gestapo, an entire network was rousing to save her with a plan that was beyond audacious in scope. Simply put, that patriotic Pole of German descent, Johann Mueller, would show up and vouch for Mrs. Gostomska as an Aryan. It would be his word against the word of an informer who turned her in. But if Mueller so much as flinched, he would share Mrs. Seidenman's fate. But we've known from the first pages of this book that Mrs. Seidenman survives. Mueller's gambit, appealing to the head of the Gestapo in Warsaw through his Germanness, works. Probably helped along by Mrs. Seidenman's own fluency in German and the swastika pin Mueller wore on his lapel and his accent. She walks freely out of the headquarters, vowing never to return to that street at all. But again, we see a flash of Mrs. Seidenman's future, and we know that she does return to Schucha Street, not as a prisoner, but as a Soviet-era career woman. And later, in 1968, Schucha Street will again humiliate her when she's removed from her job and the building because of her Jewish heritage. But all this is after the war ends, and after she attends the funeral in 1948 of Filipek, the man who arranged for Mrs. Seidenman's rescue. After surviving the camps and the end of the war, the ardent Polish patriot Filipek dies in utter poverty, completely beaten by the grinding communist system which was installed. Very few would attend his funeral, but Mrs. Seidenman did. Johann Mueller, however, would not attend Filipek's funeral. He did manage to survive the war, but knowing his German background would place him in danger as the Soviets advanced, he fled ahead of the Red Army, eventually settling in Germany. He never felt fully at home in Germany because he always considered himself Polish as well as German. He was never able to return to Warsaw, but he did manage to live long enough to see Germany reunited. It was an end he foresaw in a conversation with Mrs. Seidenman after her release from the Gestapo headquarters. As he says in the book, because a Muscovite lacks perfection, he is always short of something. He will always neglect to do something. So all this effort of his for absolute domination over man will, in the end, prove fruitless. Mueller's flight from Poland ahead of the Red Army was a part of a larger movement of Polish citizens fleeing the country as the Nazis were defeated. More than 800,000 ethnic Germans fled or were forcibly deported, with the Soviets removing many back to the Soviet Union as slave labor in recompense for Nazi deportations of Soviet citizens. By 1950, the number of expelled reached more than 3 million. Although there were German descent Poles who worked for the Home Army, like Johann Mueller, Many sided with Germany during the invasion, and atrocities had been committed. A unified Poland would not be possible as long as those divisions remained in society. The Germans had to go. But the ordinary citizens themselves faced a terrible dilemma. They were basically abandoned by the defeated Wehrmacht as punishment for having a defeatist attitude. More than 800,000 managed to flee ahead of the Red Army, but those who were unable to go were subject to severe reprisals and mass rape. Poland was in no way unusual for their post-war expulsions. People of German descent were evicted from all over Eastern Europe, notably in the former Yugoslavia. Polish expulsions accounted for only 3 million of the 12 million Germans sent to a destroyed Germany. And after the atrocities committed by Germany during the war, the Soviets and many occupied nations felt no responsibility for humanitarian aid or actions. It was the largest transfer of an ethnic population in European history. So here we again end our episode with a high and a low note. The rescue of Mrs. Seidenman from the Gestapo and the expulsion of Johann Mueller. Next week's penultimate episode takes us to page 211. As a warning, yet again, the unique style in which this book is written makes avoiding spoilers absolutely impossible. The entire book is a spoiler for itself. And if you love this book as much as I do, I highly recommend a tour of Warsaw with our Polish history expert, Marta. Marta can take you to all the sites in the beautiful Mrs. Seidenman and tell you all the stories of a city reborn from its own ashes. It's all well and good to visit a city, but it's even better to understand it. And Marta is the perfect person to get you there. See you next week in 1943 Warsaw.
Oh, I love it!